Hi. So in this presentation, we're going to be talking about the FCC. And a lot's been going on with the FCC in the last few years. There's been 2 Supreme Court hearings about the FCC. And it's really anybody's guess what it's going to mean for the future. So far, the FCC hasn't really changed their policy. But it seems likely that they probably will have to, and there's a pretty good chance that they may end up at the Supreme Court again not so long from now. So anyways, there's 3 things that the FCC forbids on broadcast television. In fact, there's one thing that they forbid on any sort of television that they regulate, so that includes satellite and cable, as well as broadcast television, and that's obscenity, which we mentioned in the previous presentation about what exactly qualifies as obscenity. Obscenity is not protected by the First Amendment, and therefore the FCC has determined that they can forbid it on any of the media that they control. Now, that said, the interpretation of obscenity seems to be primarily looking at hardcore pornography now, and it doesn't seem that language rises to the level of obscenity in any recent cases. So the ones that we're going to be focusing on are the terms indecent and profane. So this comes from the FCC's FAQ, frequently asked questions. So what makes material indecent? Indecent material contains sexual or excretory material that does not rise to the level of obscenity. For this reason, the courts have held that indecent material is protected by the First Amendment and cannot be banned entirely. It may, however, be restricted to avoid its broadcast during times of the day when there is a reasonable risk that children may be in the audience. The FCC has determined, with the approval of the courts, that there is a reasonable risk that children will be in the audience from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. local time. Therefore, the FCC prohibits station licensees from broadcasting indecent material during that period. Material is indecent if, in context, it depicts or describes sexual or excretory organs or activities in terms patently offensive as measured by contemporary community standards for the broadcast medium. In each case, the FCC must determine whether the material describes or depicts sexual or excretory organs or activities, and if so, whether the material is patently offensive. In our assessment of whether a material is patently offensive, context is critical. The FCC looks at 3 primary factors when analyzing broadcast material. 1, whether the description or depiction is explicit or graphic, whether the material dwells on or repeats at length descriptions or depictions of sexual or excretory organs, and whether the material appears to pander or is used to titillate or shock. No single factor is determinative. The FCC weighs and balances these factors because each case presents its own mix of these and possibly other factors. Okay, now, the thing I want to focus on here is that, of course, there's the 2 areas of taboo words that they're focusing on, which is obscenity, in our sense, not in the legal sense, and scatology, so sex and bathroom stuff. All right, now that's indecency. And then, not so long ago, only recently, they created this other category of profanity that they also regulate against. What makes material profane? Profane language includes those words that are so highly offensive that their mere utterance in the context presented may, in legal terms, amount to a nuisance. In its Golden Globe Awards order, the FCC warned broadcasters that depending on the context, it would consider the F word and those words or variants thereof that are as highly offensive as the F word to be profane, language that cannot be broadcast between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. All right, now, what this is getting at is a particular decision that they made according to in reaction to complaints. And the FCC is reactionary. They do not patrol the broadcast. They respond to complaints from the viewers. All right, now, what they're getting at is this, let's see if I can go to it, 2002 event Well, actually, the 2002 event is a little bit of background here. Because in 2002, the Billboard Music Awards, which were broadcast live, Cher said, "Fuck 'em." And that got on live TV. That was 2002. In 2003, and this is the one that they're actually referring to, the Golden Globe Awards, Bono, in receiving a Golden Globe Award, said, "This is really fucking brilliant." And again, live television, and it made it to the airwaves. Now, the same year, at the Billboard Music Awards, Nicole Richie said, "Have you ever tried to get cow shit out of a Prada purse? It's not so fucking simple." Now, in this case, interestingly, as I understand it, Richie actually said some other things that were taboo. I think she said shit a couple times before that. But they were actually able to bleep those out. There was a slight time delay at that live show, and there was a person with their finger on the bleeper, but they missed the cow shit and fucking here, and so that made it to the broadcast. All right, now, with that background in mind, and remember that this is the Golden Globes Award decision that they're talking about, well, in 2004, the FCC had received an awful lot of complaints about Bono. And so their decision was as follows. So the FCC decided that with regard to the Bono case, the phrase at issue is within the scope of our indecency definition because it does depict or describe sexual activities. We recognize NBC's argument that the F word here was used as an intensifier. Nevertheless, we believe that given the core meaning of the F word, any use of that word or a variation in any context inherently has a sexual connotation and therefore falls within the first prong of our indecency definition. So basically, what they're doing now is getting into this idea of profanity, that there are some words, like fuck, that are so bad that even out of context, it's bad enough to rise to the level of indecency. That's what they're basically getting at here, which was new. They then disavowed prior decisions in which it had said that isolated expletives would not warrant an enforcement action. So now they go back and they say, okay, well, that Cher event that happened in 2002, where she said fuck 'em, and that event with Richie, where she said shit and fucking, that those they could go back and revisit in light of their decision with regard to Bono and say, yep, those were bad, we're going to now fine you. So the FCC fined Fox Television for those two events, and Fox said, hey, that's not right, and they fought it clear to the Supreme Court, which heard the case in 2008. So now we're going to look at some excerpts from the 2008 court cases, or court case rather, in the Supreme Court. So, I gotta keep moving this thing around. All right, Chief Justice Roberts, and the Supreme Court kind of works in an interesting way. Basically, the justices ask questions of the lawyers for the two parties. So Chief Justice Roberts says, I suppose the most difficult case for you is the early news case, where you have a fleeting expletive, unlike Saving Private Ryan and the others. I mean, how do you distinguish the early news case from the ones before us? And so partly what he's getting at is this fleeting expletive is one part of it, because prior to 2004, they'd been saying, well, you know, if it happens just once, we know people are human, it happens, okay, you know, if you know, on live television you accidentally swear, okay, we'll let it pass as long as it doesn't happen repeatedly. So that's a fleeting expletive. And he's asking specifically about an early news case, you know, what happens on a news broadcast. And the lawyer for the FCC said, the Commission has determined that news programming would be treated differently with greater restraint because of the different values present in that situation. All right, now, that's important to us, right? Because that points to something that we've been talking about, is that context certainly plays a role. And Chief Justice Roberts says, so the same, if you had a news report about Nicole Richie and the Cher exhibits, they could use the actual language, even though they can't during the awards shows. And the lawyer says yes. And similarly, if there were a news report about the argument today in this court and there were reports about the actual language used, that's right. So basically what he's saying is recognizing the use-mention distinction. He's saying, okay, you can talk about these words, and in doing so you have to state them. So you can say, Nicole Richie said, have you ever tried to get shit out of a Prada purse? Cher said, fuck 'em. Bono said, this is really fucking brilliant. So in the news reports, they can say that and they can get away with it because it's a different context. And I think, and he's tacitly recognizing that quoting is different than use. All right, now, the hearing continued with Justice Ginsburg saying, are there only those 2 words in the FCC's new policy, or are there other words on the list? And the lawyer says, well, certainly the FCC's action in this case focuses on the use of the F word and the S word, and I think everyone acknowledges that a word like the F word is one of the most graphic, explicit, and vulgar words in the English language for sexual activity. And I think even the networks here concede that it was. Its use was gratuitous and inappropriate here, which I find kind of funny because basically it's just avoiding the question. And when you go to the website for the FCC, they pretty much avoid the question as well and just say, well, anything that's as bad as fuck is bad and therefore falls under profanity, but they won't say what those words are. So then Justice Stevens says, isn't it true that that is a word that often is used with no reference whatsoever to the sexual connotation? And the lawyer says, it can be. It certainly can be used in a non-literal way. It can be used in a metaphorical way, as Cher used it here to say F them to her critics. But the non-literal, literal distinction is not unique to the isolated expletives versus the repeated effort expletives. So basically what Gar is saying here is, yes, you're right, Justice Stevens, but I don't want to get into that because that doesn't have anything to do with this trial, which was about fleeting expletives and, can they start just, slapping fines because of one incident of fuck. Now, it's interesting because what Stevens is getting at is that in the initial decision by the FCC, they actually said that it didn't rise to the level of indecency because it wasn't sexual. And then the higher-ups in the FCC overturned that initial ruling and said, well, yeah, it is. It's always sexual. So, I don't know. I find that kind of funny. Now, oops. Let me continue on with this hearing, and I'll get out of the way of Scalia here. So, Justice Stevens says, do you think it's equally subject to being treated as indecent within the meaning of the statute, regardless of which meaning was actually apparent to everyone who listened to it? And the lawyer says, I wouldn't say equally, Justice Stevens, but what we would say is that it can qualify as indecent under the Commission's definition, because even the non-literal use of a word like the F word, because of the core meaning of that word as one of the most vulgar, graphic, and explicit words for sexual activity in the English language, it inevitably conjures up core sexual image. Now, I have to say, I'm not sure about that. That's an empirical claim that the general is making there without any substantiation of it. And I really wish the lawyers would have, or the justices rather, would have called him on that. And in fact, we've seen over the course of this semester that may not actually be true. For example, in Quebecois French, the very worst word that you can say, according to quite a few native speakers, is tabernacle. Well, what also people seem to agree is that quite a few people who use that word tabernacle and understand that it's one of the most taboo words in Quebecois French don't necessarily know what it originally meant, and it doesn't seem to conjure up its literal meaning of a cabinet in which you keep the chalice. So I'm not sure I buy that it inevitably conjures up a core sexual image. For example, when a 5-year-old hears the word fuck and understands that it's a taboo word, it doesn't mean that they understand what sex is. So, I have to say, with all due respect to Justice Scalia and to General Gar, I think they're wrong when Justice Scalia says which is indeed why it's used. Now, Justice Ginsburg then jumps in and says, How are the contemporary community standards determined in this context? Does the FCC survey any particular audience to find out what their standards are? And General Gar responds, well, first of all, the community standards are community standards for the broadcast medium. This is set out a little bit at page 33 of the joint appendix at footnote 13. Second of all, they look to community standards for the average listener. And third of all, the Commission applies its expressly collective experience here, looking to statements from lawmakers, from courts, from broadcasters, from public interest groups, and from citizens to determine what is consistent with community standards. All of that is to say, in short, no. That, in fact, the FCC has not conducted any survey of any particular audience. They basically are applying the rule that they know it when they see it. In contrast, the BBC has done that. They've done a massive, in cooperation with the advertising something commission. I don't remember what the acronym is. But the BBC, in England, along with the Advertising Commission, they actually did conduct a massive survey to find out what viewers consider to be the worst of the worst words and which ones should not be allowed on broadcast television. It does not seem that the FCC has done that. They are relying on their own common sense. All right. Now, in 2010, so what the Supreme Court did, I should add, in 2008, their decision was basically that no, the FCC hadn't overstepped its bounds in being arbitrary or capricious, which is what the lower courts had said, was that the FCC had been arbitrary and capricious. And so they said, no, they weren't arbitrary and capricious, but there's a bigger issue at heart here, and that is a First Amendment issue. Was this censorship within was it constitutional according to the First Amendment? And so they kicked it back to the lower court, which the lower court seems a little frustrated by in their ruling. They seem to be a little unsure of what they're supposed to even be doing now that the Supreme Court has kicked it back to them. So the Second Supreme Court, after deliberating and realizing that this was inevitably going to end up back at the Supreme Court, this is their ruling. The absence of reliable guidance in the FCC standards chills a vast amount of protected speech dealing with some of the most important and universal themes in art and literature. Sex and the magnetic power of sexual attraction are surely among the most predominant themes in the study of humanity since the Trojan War. The digestive system and excretion are also important areas of human attention. By prohibiting all patently offensive references to sex, sexual organs, and excretion without giving adequate guidance as to what patently offensive means, the FCC effectively chills speech because broadcasters have no way of knowing what the FCC will find offensive. To place any discussion of these vast topics at the broadcaster's peril has the effect of promoting wide self-censorship of valuable material, which should be completely protected under the First Amendment. They went on and quoted from an earlier Supreme Court, a 1940 decision, "It is not merely the sporadic abuse of power by the censor, but the pervasive threat inherent in its very existence that constitutes the danger to freedom of discussion." So what they're saying is that by virtue of the FCC having this policy against indecency, they are in effect censoring, that they're creating this chill and they are limiting the freedom of expression of the broadcasters. And so they're saying that's a First Amendment violation. Even if the FCC, as they maintain, that they don't overstep their bounds, they're saying merely by your existence, you're threatening freedom of expression because your wording is so vague that broadcasters are erring on the side of caution, and so they're not broadcasting things that they would reasonably broadcast for fear of getting a fine. Now, so they're saying basically it's too vague. And it got kicked up back to the Supreme Court, not surprisingly. In 2012, the Supreme Court reheard the case, and everybody was kind of excited about it and thought, well, this was going to be a real big test of the First Amendment and censorship and so on. And so here's just a few excerpts from it. General Verrilli is now the lawyer for the FCC. The Commission could have a list that said, never say the following: however many words, between the hours of 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. That would be clearer. But in a way, the Commission here, I think, by following the context-based approach that I think Pacifica suggested was required, is being, punished is too strong a word, but it's being held against it that is trying to make a reasonable accommodations for First Amendment values. And so I think when one looks at it in both terms of where the lenses actually ought to be focused here, and the fact that the alternative of perfect clarity would reach a less effective accommodation of First Amendment values, then I do think the Commission's position is quite reasonable and defensible. What he's getting at, so they're saying, well, why not just have a list? Why not just list all of those words that are bad? Say fuck is bad, shit is bad, cunt is bad, blah, 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 blah. Just list them and that would be clearer. And they're saying, well, that would be a First Amendment violation because it's not nuanced enough. It doesn't account for the fact that sometimes those words may be necessary to get the point across, whatever it is. And they have concluded that in the past, for example, with Saving Private Ryan, they declared that fuck could stay in that when broadcast on TV because it was necessary for the context of World War II. And they've decided it in other cases as well, that those words were legitimate. In other cases, they didn't. So in a documentary about the blues, they decided that PBS couldn't air it unexpurgated. As you can imagine, blues singers have salty mouths, and they decided, no, that one could not keep all of the fucks in it that the blues singers said. So that context didn't warrant it, but World War II apparently did. And that's, again, part of the complaint against the FCC is, how are the broadcasters supposed to know, what context licenses fuck? Okay, now, they're saying, but at the same time, it's got to be nuanced. We can't forbid it altogether all the time. And then Mr. Waxman here, let me move this up, he's the lawyer for Fox, says that expletives in a documentary about blues musicians is indecent, but even more of those expletives in a fictional movie about World War II is constitutionally intolerable. And Chief Justice Roberts responded, people understand. What you've demonstrated, I think, is that the context matters. People understand that, including children. When they hear a bad word, when someone hits their thumb with a hammer, they understand that's different than having an adult stand in normal conversation and use the words. And it seems to me that your position is saying that the government cannot regulate with an understanding of what takes place in the real world. The government's effort is to try to understand the context. That's why you get a different rule in Saving Private Ryan than you get with Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie. And what your argument seems to be is they can't take context into account. I have to say, I admire what Justice Roberts is saying here. I think that was a very cogent argument here. And he sums up exactly why we have to take context into consideration. And that's exactly why censorship law is so incredibly challenging. Well, to sum up, basically, the Supreme Court made a decision in this case. It was a unanimous decision, which is really unusual. Kagan had to, I think it was Kagan, had to recuse herself because of a conflict of interest. She had actually worked on some of the previous cases. But it was a unanimous decision of all of those justices involved, which is unusual. But to the disappointment of a great many, they didn't decide on the First Amendment issue. They decided on a due process issue. Basically said that the FCC had not met due process, that they couldn't go back and change the rules in retrospect and tell Fox that you violated the rules that had not been in effect previous to that. That seems kind of obvious, and it seems the Supreme Court likes to choose the more simple ruling. But they did kind of hint that the FCC was on notice, that that there was a good chance that the lower court was correct about this being unconstitutional, and that they better watch themselves, and that they ought to change their policy. Now, from what I've observed in the year and a half that's intervened since this ruling, they have not changed their policy. And when I go to their to the FCC's website, it doesn't seem that they've changed much. At least in their wording. But I think there's a pretty good chance that in the next few years you're going to see some changes at the FCC. And if not, I think we should expect more court cases, and eventually I expect it will work its way back to the Supreme Court.